Hana, and I am the Go Learn program coordinator. If you have not joined us before, Go Learn is the official alumni travel provider at the University of Utah. And we don't just offer to the alumni of the U, but also to the whole community. So if you ever find you're interested in any of our travel programs, you're welcome to join us when we get back to traveling after COVID. Today, we're really excited to have Hōkūlani Aikau with us. And she is an associate professor in the Division of Gender Studies and the Division of Ethnic Studies. And she's also the director of Pacific Island Studies. I think I got it right, but correct me later if I'm wrong, Hōkūlani. During her presentation, you're welcome to submit questions throughout the whole presentation. And then at the end, we'll address the questions. We'll leave a little bit of time for any questions that you submit throughout. So go ahead, at the bottom of the screen, there's a question box where you can submit any questions that you have. Hōkūlani will be speaking with us today about the Detours Project, curating a decolonial guide to Hawaii. And I have to admit, I've never been to Hawaii before. I grew up in 7 different countries and I've traveled all over the world, but I still haven't been to Hawaii, so I'm really excited about this presentation. And I think a lot of us imagine Hawaii as a beautiful beach with luau's and fun paradise. But Hōkūlani is going to talk to us a little bit about the struggles of Native Hawaiians and the problems brought on by colonialism and military occupation and tourism and food insecurity and so on. And her project really aims to offer people a way to engage with Hawaii's culture and history in a more holistic way. And I'm really excited to learn more about how we can do that. So I will pass the time on now to Hōkūlani so that we can learn a little bit more about that.
Aloha. Okay, it's the strangest thing to present to, my own picture. So bear with me if it feels a little awkward. But yeah, aloha. I want to start with some mahalos. First off to Christoph at Go Learn at Home series for being able to present this on my book, which is co-edited with Bernadette Gonzalez and has about 45 contributors. So it's not just my book. It's a book that was made possible by many, many different people, and a lot of people contributed to it. I also want to thank Sandra for handling the logistics and for Ben for making sure that the technology operates smoothly in this day and age. We know how important that is. I also want to thank, there's a lot of organizations that made this possible, this book possible. And I want to thank the Hawaiʻi Council for the Humanities, for their generous support. The American Studies Association small grant allowed us to do a lot of development on the front end of the book. We also want to thank the University of Hawaii at Manoa Office of Undergraduate Education, the American Studies Department, and the Center for Philippine Studies, all at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, as well as the University of Utah School for Cultural and Social Transformation for providing us with additional funding, which was needed for the subvention to make this book possible. And I also want to thank an anonymous donor who contributed to the production of this book as well. So, today I'm presenting to you from the lands of the Eastern Shoshone people, the Ute, the Goshute, and some of the Paiute peoples. And today on this cold yet sunny day in what we now call Utah, a presentation on Hawaii seemed really desirable, right? It's like, as Sandra said, even I would like to be on a beach in the warm sun at this very moment, as I'm not quite ready for the snows to come and to be around until the spring. So, but today I want you to be prepared to have that fantasy of going to Hawaii be unsettled. And perhaps to have to uncomfortably sit in that place of chilliness of what it means to do a decolonial guide or to have a decolonial visit or approach to Hawaii. So let me start my presentation. Let's see if this works. Here we go. So I want to start with this photograph that my son took as we were driving south on I-15 from Salt Lake City down to Utah Valley. It's on the side of the highway. He literally took it out the window as we were driving by. This was our second time down to Salt Lake County. From Salt Lake County down to Utah County in like over the course of a weekend. And we missed it the first time. So the next time we went down, I'm like, get ready, get ready. So what we have here is a billboard. It's located somewhere between Lehigh and American Fork, for those of you who know, the I-15 corridor between Salt Lake City and Utah County. And I think it captures both the desire, the way that people understand and desire Hawaii, as well as the image that we're trying to push back against in this volume. So I think the sign juxtaposed beside the American flag, another sign for sure, taps into drivers' desires for a particular kind of Hawaii, one that beckons them into luxury and relaxation, a Hawaii waiting for their arrival, right? So if we look at this, and this one is sponsored by Aloha Utah, which I presume is a company specifically targeting tourism from Utah to Hawaii. And when you, from like the far left lane, you'd be able to see the entire sign, but what it is a photograph of one of the many hotels, luxury hotels, and it's unclear on what island it is. So it's a generic image, but also capturing very specific kinds of tourist desires. As this billboard illustrates and represents, the tourism industry markets Hawaii as a holiday destination for tourists. The postcard is also a kind of shorthand for Hawaii as an example, as an exotic tourist tropical paradise. What the postcard and billboard do, however, is elide the very real present-day struggles with colonialism, military occupation, Native Hawaiian dispossession, food sovereignty, environmental degradation, and problems of sustainability. The billboard and the postcard are the visual sedimentation of how the islands have been represented, particularly by the West. Guidebooks, travel narratives, and fiction also constitute the bulk of this fantasy island archive. From Captain Cook and his crew in the 18th century, these travel narratives have dominated and really shaped the way that people understand the imagination and the imaginary that frames Hawaii as a tropical paradise. So we have Mark Twain, who in the 1860s visited Hawaii and wrote a series of articles about Hawaii. We have the English woman Isabella Bird, who wrote 6 Months in Hawaii, again, beginning to construct this archive of Hawaii as tropical paradise. We have James Michener's book, his epic novel, Hawaii, that celebrated statehood in 1959. And since then, writers have captured Hawaii with a very specific Western imaginary of paradise. We can also see this in films. But tourists today consume the Hawaii that has been substantiated through these narratives of discovery in the guidebook, a particular kind of genre. Guidebooks are the most popular genre of writing depicting the islands. They offer up Hawaii for easy consumption, tantalizingly reveal its secrets, orient a particular relationship to the islands, and suggest the most efficient ways to make the most of a holiday. We are all probably quite familiar with these texts and these kinds of narratives. They are everywhere. The Detour Project, however, takes seriously the power of form and the reading practices, imaginaries, and publics produced by these texts, their power to manifest the fantasies of the exotic into actual material island destinations for the collective consumption of tourists. When we first started the project, our intention was to take the guidebook form and deliberately pervert it to offer alternative narratives, tours, itineraries, mappings, and images of Hawaii. However, as the project took shape, we asked ourselves, how would one write about Hawaii and the different sites and practices we wanted to highlight without falling into the same trap as the guidebook? And so a new set of questions started to coalesce. So our first question is, how do we frame the alternative encounter between, and this alternative encounter with Hawaii as something worth engaging, right? When people are taught to desire the tourist version of Hawaii, how do we convince them to want a different kind of experience or relationship with Hawaii, right? Like, how do we undo some of that early programming in order to offer up something else. How does the history of Hawaii as a sovereign indigenous place guide this project's interventions? Here, we're thinking about how do we push back in explicit kinds of ways against the idea that the question of Hawaii's inclusion in the United States is an old one? How do we keep that question open and one that's contentious? And then third, how do we balance writing about place in loving detail, aloha, without making it an open invitation or making clear that there's a protocol for engaging or not engaging with certain places depending on one's positionality? How do we invite folks to Hawaii? How do we uninvite folks to Hawaii, as Haunani K. Trask did about 20 years ago now? How do we tell tourists that they do not get to have an open invitation to everywhere and whenever they want? How do we do that? So these are not easy questions to answer, and my co-author Bernadette Gonzalez and I didn't have all of the answers to those questions. So we turned to our contributors and our personal and professional experiences to figure out how to answer them. And during the development stage of the project, which took about a year or more, we hosted several writing workshops, and we talked about these questions and other concerns that emerged with our contributors. And what we realized is that what we were not going to produce was a guidebook. Rather, what we wanted to produce was a decolonial guide. The project then shifted to a guide to decolonization. And it takes on some of the conceits of the guidebook, but centers the tourist gaze and reorients relationships to place according to those practices and ethics that contribute to the work of decolonization. And while we initially saw tourists as the first audience for this project, we've come to recenter and center residents of Hawaii, both native and non-native alike, who, as a result of settler colonialism, may not themselves know the indigenous histories under the concrete and steel of tourism, militarism, and development. So in its current form, it's pretty clear about what Detours does. It offers alternative encounters with place through a range of storytelling that is tied to place-based responsibility, or in Hawaiian, we'd call that kuleana. Its ultimate vision is to contribute to a broader decolonial movement in Hawaii. So our goals are twofold. First, I won't go to that one yet. We seek to interrupt tourism's hold on the narratives about Hawaii and provide alternative viewpoints and approaches that allow for a deeper understanding of what lies beneath the facade of tourism. Second, the essay's personal reflections, artwork, and maps that make up Detours provide examples of how activists, academics, and communities are working to radically disrupt the frames, disrupt these frames to restore and nurture ʻea. So this quote comes from Noelani Goodyear Ka'upua, who's a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And it is part of the introduction to A Nation Rising, which documents the political and economic and social movements from the 1970s that coalesced into what is called the cultural nationalism movement and movement for sovereignty in Hawaii. And what I like about this quote, and I'll read it here, is that it gives us a sense of what ʻea means and how we enact it, what it takes to restore ʻea. So ʻea is based on the experiences of people on the land, relationships forged through the process of remembering and caring for wahipana, storied places. ʻea is an active state of being. ʻea cannot be achieved or possessed. It requires constant action, day after day, generation after generation. And I emphasize that part because, again, decolonization or the restoration of ʻea is not a set of boxes that can be checked. It's a way of being in relationship to place in a very intentional set of practices. And that's what Detours captures. So the book then is a guide that considers the different ways that communities are working together to restore ʻea, the breath, life, sovereignty of Hawaii. The lāhui Hawaii, the Hawaiian Nation, has tactically, strategically, and persistently resisted dismemberment and military occupation. We wanted Detours to provide readers with concrete examples of how we move from metaphors of decolonization to material practices and everyday acts of resurgence that bring about real change in the lives of people, transforming our relationships with land as ʻāina so it can better feed us again. And while this is a guide, it should not be construed as a blanket invitation, which is what the guidebook does, right? The guidebook assumes that people can just go to all of the places that are represented there. But in our book, not everyone who reads this book will be invited or allowed to all of the places that are described. There are places and knowledges that have been left out altogether because they were not meant for outsiders. And we honor the wishes of the community who have asked that this book not be an open invitation to visitors. We ask that readers and visitors respect their wishes and follow their protocol for how to engage or not. Sometimes the best way to support decolonization and Kanaka ʻōiwi resurgence is to not come as a tourist to Hawaii at all. I know that that's a pretty radical thing to be talking about with a program that organizes tours, but I think it's an important one to underline and reinforce. Sometimes the best way to support Hawaii is to not come at all. And I think that becomes really critical right now in this time of pandemic, where they're thinking about reopening tourism and people are going to travel there. And it's totally possible that the health of the people who are living in Hawaii will be negatively impacted in order to fulfill our own desires for tropical paradise or for escape from everything that's going on around us. So I think we need to be always attentive to those power dynamics. So when I say the our in our sentence recognizes that Kanaka and non-Kanaka call Hawaii home, and that we all need to relearn, unlearn, learn anew how to live in Hawaii or visit Hawaii in radically different ways, in ways that allow the ʻāina and the wai, the land and the water, to be able to support the lāhui, the people, once again. Thus, an important underlying assumption of this book is that not all knowledge, information, or access to places is open and available to everyone. We understand that within a touristic framework, again, this is a radically audacious idea, but it's one that we came to realize was paramount in putting a book together like this. We also recognize, however, that this uninvitation is disconcerting, and it should be. Hawaii is an ideal tourist destination. It's made possible by an infrastructure built for and around visitors' comfort, safety, and pleasure. That infrastructure and the ideas, values, and decisions that support it were and are built on historical and present day dispossession of Kanaka ʻōiwi, the indigenous peoples of Hawaii. So unless we actively work to dismantle this infrastructure and refuse the tourist imaginary, we will, wittingly or unwittingly, contribute to the reproduction of the occupation and colonization of the peoples, places, and practices of Hawaii. We ask readers then to contribute to preparing for a different future. And if this knowledge at all makes you uneasy, and if you want to approach and engage Hawaii differently with a sense of pono and kuleana, responsibility, privilege, and authority, then we invite you to come with us on the Huaka'i that is made possible in this book. Instead of looking at what Hawaii can offer the reader, and it has much to offer the reader, we ask readers to think instead of what they can learn from and contribute to ongoing efforts towards sustaining ea. So two terms really capture the tensions in this book. Again, that invitation, uninvitation, it's a guide, but it's not all of that, right? The first one is aloha, a term whose meaning incorporates notions of compassion, regard, fondness, among many other sentiments of mutual affection and reciprocity. The second term, ole, which means no, never, no. These two terms remind us that we must take heed and proceed with caution. Aloha is the Kanaka term most identified with the tourism industry. As noted above, the tourism industry uses the term aloha to represent, market, and promote Hawaii and Native Hawaiians as naturally hospitable and welcoming. Such representations have contributed to how colonial powers, the United States foremost among them, have translated this to mean an unconditional open door. So that's aloha. A beautiful poetry essay by No'u Revilla and Jamaica, Heoli Mele Ikalani Osorio, titled Aloha is Deoccupied Love, provides a deeper, infinitely nuanced, and more profound engagement with this term than has been flattened by tourism, establishing it as a radical, action-infused word. I quote, "Our aloha is born from the power of creation as established in our mo'olelo," end quote, delinking aloha from its perversion as a tourist greeting or as a marketing tool for things like snowboard and ski rentals. So I was in Park City recently, and there's a company called Aloha Snowboard and Ski Rentals. And again, not the aloha I'm talking about. So they delink aloha from these commodified tourist frameworks and instead insist on its power in, quote, generative and honest interactions made possible when we share things with others in sustainable ways and through relations that require, okay, emphasis on require, reciprocity. Sorry, I gotta change my note. And responsibility. As they put it, quote, "While the word is a common expression in Hawai'i, particularly in greetings, it is important to remember that aloha is not tourist oriented. The practice does not exist for consumption, purchase, or display. Aloha cannot be owned like property, like a souvenir," end quote. So identifying aloha as the power that fuels deoccupied love, it moves from tourist commodity to generative force of revolution. This indeed is leagues away from the aloha as inferred consent for occupation or even an open invitation. Next, we have a'ole. A'ole is a demand that has not been equally heard, although it too has been uttered with the earliest instances of overreach and overstaying in Hawaii. In David Maile's account of the tradition of refusal from before the overthrow to the Ku'e petitions to the Department of Interior's hearings on federal recognition in 2014, a'ole is a familiar refrain. Structuring his essay around the mountain of a'ole that the Department of Interior representatives in the summer of 2014 heard, Maile quotes testimony after testimony. Quote, "Your answer for me is no. You cannot give me back something I never gave up. Take your thing you want to give us, throw them in the trash. We don't want it. We sovereign," as quoted by Maile in his essay. So we placed these essays in the section Hana Lima, Decolonial Representations and Practices, in order to provoke, to frame this guide by defamiliarizing one term and reestablishing another. In juxtaposing these two terms, we capture and establish a tension reflected throughout, which demands an accounting of established notions of Hawaii that are built on foreign desires and a consent that was never given. So let's turn to the book. As we moved, like I said, as we moved away from the guidebook, we also had to think about how we were going to organize the book differently. So guidebooks are typically organized around itineraries for each of the different islands. And we started there, and I'm glad we started there because it allowed us as editors to make sure we were thinking about representation across the ʻāina, the archipelago. And as the contributions came in, the essays, the arts, the maps came in, what emerged were thematic commonalities around place and methods of decolonial work, which became the organizing structure for the book. So here we have, the book is organized into these 4 main parts with a conclusion that is brief, but open-ended. I'm going to skip through this little part here to get to our first section. Part 1, Wahipana Storied Places. You know, we embarked on this book by valuing Indigenous knowledge. And for Indigenous people, places, as our ancestors, it's all about place. It's about the land upon which we stand, and it's about our relationships with land. So part 1 is about place and our relationships to it. And it lingers on a number of places whose histories have been forgotten, buried, or misrepresented. Tourism and its sibling development have had a lot to do with how the deep histories of these sites have faded from contemporary view, or from memory, or re-narrated only in terms of tourist access and consumption. So in Hawaii, wahipana is the term we use to designate a place as sacred or legendary. And there are a number of pieces that coalesce around genealogical ties to place, love letters in written and visual form. The mo'olelo in this section remind us that place and directionality are always under contestation in Hawaii, and how Indigenous acts of remembering place and passing that knowledge on are part of a larger decolonial strategy. So we open this section with an essay by Kamana Beamer, which begins with a humorous story, it's really funny, about being at the beach with his kids when he's asked how far it is to the Kona airport by hurried tourists. His response, quote, about 20 ahupua'a to the south, end quote. So in the story, the tourists look at him with like a shocked look on their face, like they didn't know how to respond to him. And what we wanted to start with that sort of perplexity, because it drives home an Indigenous system of palena, of place boundaries, and establishes a more intimate knowledge of Hawaiian geography and place, right? If we're going to say that we want to displace, decenter the tourist understandings, then we have to add something in its place, and what we are is the Indigenous understanding of geography and place. So this tension between Hawaiian geography and tourist directionality is then illuminated by another essay or series of poems by Brandy Nolani McDougall. And here she's juxtaposing Google Maps with mo'olelo, and mo'olelo is the Hawaiian word for stories. So her poems include meditations on Haleakala, Honokahau, Kuka'o'o Heiau, and the King Kamehameha statues. In her poem, Waikiki on Google Maps, Satellite View, Brandy contrasts Google's cartography of Ali'i with Indigenous memory. The first stanzas show how Ali'i have been reduced to street names. Let me read them to you. In Waikiki, Lili'u Hōkūlani is just a few blocks from the Royal Hawaiian Shopping Center and runs Mauka from Kalakaua to the Alawai. Kuhio meets with her amidst vacation condos. Here, Ali'i names designate shopping and lodging in Waikiki's tourist jungle. The last stanza is a poignant reminder of what remains and what remains to be taken back. Search the brown canal water that once fed the marshes for any part of us that is still ours. Whatever remains after even the names of our kings and queens have been taken, left roaming the streets. The poignancy of what remains reminds us of what has been taken. In a series of 6 images, Kapulani Landgraph, her series, Ponoiwi, presents a series of manipulated photographs of places on Maui, another important tourist destination. So Landgraph draws our attention to Keone Hana sites of generations of Oiwi ancestors that have been desecrated by the construction industry on both Maui and Oahu. In her artist statement, Kapulani Landgraph outlines the history of sand extraction for the construction industry, describing how this process essentially mined the beaches and hills of Maui in order to build roads, buildings, and bases on Oahu. In this image, Pu'unene flattened. The text describes the location of a heiau that was located at the base of the Pu'u borders and borders the open wound of the land that has been excavated, encircling the scar of development. It is a chant of memory. Another striking image in her, Kapulani clarifies the double violence at work in this moment, leaving no border between the land and the iwi, or the bones. She writes, Native Hawaiians buried the iwi, the bones of their ancestors, within the sand dunes throughout Hawaii. They believed the mana of the person lived in the bones. Ola naivi. The bones live. At Honokahua, Maui in 1989, over 1,000 Native Hawaiian remains were removed to build the Ritz-Carlton Kapalua Resort, end quote. So despite the 1990 law protecting burial sites, there is a continued pressure to develop Hawaiian ʻāina, land and its natural resources, and Hawaiian iwi are constantly threatened. Navai e ho'ola ina iwi, who will protect our bones? So in these images, Hōkūlani uses text to show the incursions and violences upon the land, which renders it into base material for extraction under capitalism, under a capitalist regime, rather than as ʻāina, as ancestor and living kin. So, okay. In part 2, Hana Lima, Decolonial Representations and Projects, we move from place-based, the remembering of places, to thinking about, and it explores the practices that restore or establish people's connections to those places and the practices that are connected to them as well. So Hana Lima, which means working with our hands, singles out the importance of putting muscle power behind the work of creating new visions and kipukas or oases of decolonial life. For us, Hana Lima is also the labor of restoring or reestablishing and reaffirming the relationship between people and places through actions based on aloha ʻāina, or love of land, or patriotism to the Hawaiian Nation. These include community-based and place-based efforts around the revival of cultural practices and ongoing struggles against and alongside tourism as a dominant economic engine for the islands. In a decolonial context, we note the craft, skill, and efforts that are marshaled on many fronts to generate a new imagination of and future for Hawaii, to make space and defend Oiwi sovereignty, to restore and invigorate cultural practices and knowledge, and to mobilize the people of Hawaii, native and non-native alike, to work towards sovereignty. And this is the work of decolonizing Hawaii. So what I wanted to show today, for an example from this section, are a couple of postcards that Karen Kosasa and Stan Tomita developed, because I think they provide a beautiful contrast between tourist postcards that reflect the sedimentation of desires, of tourist desires for Hawaii, and this one throws all of that on its head. So Karen and Stan have produced a 4-postcard series titled Didactic Detour Project that poses the question, whose paradise? This deck of postcards focus a jarring contradiction that unsettle Hawaii's image of paradise, juxtaposing scenes of Hawaii with unorthodox postcard explanatory text. So the pedagogical project takes on a form that has overwhelmingly contributed to a particular image of Hawaii, right? And it turns it on its head, demanding more from it. So when we juxtapose these ones with the opening, it becomes really shocking, right? And so whereas the billboard invites the driver to dream about and long for Hawaii as place of rest and relaxation, Kosasa and Tomita's postcards pose a warning. And that's what this postcard is doing. A warning that all is not well in paradise and Hawaii is under siege. So in other words, these are postcards that would never be sold to tourists, and yet in both form and content, they do the work of unsettling notions of paradise that tourists and some residents hold to be true. By inserting the history of US empire into the visual lexicon of tourism, Karen and Stan's postcards do the work of decolonial refusal, turning the ubiquitous postcard into a text for cultivating awe. I also love this series of postcards because teachers, if there are any teachers out there, this is something that students could do as well, you know, to create a decolonial postcard or to use postcards as a way of communicating meaning to different kinds of audiences. So we have this one, which is occupation, check. And then here we have current threats to Hawaii. Again, we have those images of the 30-meter telescopes on Mauna Kea. We have, and then tourists themselves become, again, one of these invasive species that damage our ecosystems in Hawaii. Another example from this section is Welcome to the Future that was co-authored by Kalani Ua Ridi, Panahano Naeha, Noelani Goodyear Kaupua, and Julie Warwick about, and this one comes from a land-based project, a local fish pond on Moloka'i, and works to counter representations of the island. So this piece is a collaborative piece on the Keawa Nui Fish Pond on Moloka'i, and it documents their collective effort to restore fish ponds as part of a vision of food self-sufficiency. But Keawa Nui is one of the only functionally local ancestral Hawaiian fish ponds on Moloka'i, spanning more than 60 acres. Keawa Nui cannot be conceived of as just one thing. It is as much a political and cultural project as it is a place. This piece is not an invitation to visit Keawa Nui, but rather an invitation to glimpse possible futures that are open when one looks and pays close attention to Oiwi relationships between Kanaka and the structures on the land that make it ʻāina, make land that which feeds us. So I think this is another one of these really amazing essays that centers Indigenous knowledge and practices and shows what sustainability could look like from that kind of vantage point. And I think between the postcards and this particular and the fish pond example, it gives you a sense of the breadth of work that's happening on the ground to transform Hawaii and restore Ea. So let's move to part 3. Part 3 is called Huaka'i, Tours for Transformation. And it features actual tours in practice that address geographic, environmental, social, and political issues on the islands, transformative practices of journeying that have been revived or imaginative itineraries that unsettle tourism's mobilities. A Huaka'i is not an empty itinerary, but rather a journey defined by intention. Its purposefulness is crucial. It is demanding. The Huaka'i that are offered in this section have very precise aims of moving people through a place and providing new ways of looking at and interacting with some of the history, struggles, and relationships that shape Hawaii. It demands that you journey with deliberation and an openness to being disquieted by what you might learn about a place and yourself. It will place you in relationships to people and to the land that you might not expect, and which will demand something of you, a shift in perspective, an injunction to take action, a challenge to get involved. So I wanted to share the Hawaii Detours Project by Kyle Kajihiro and Auntie Terry Keko'olani. So they do a detour, and the book title comes from their tour, the Detour Project. And we are so grateful to them for letting us use their title for this book and for the future book series. So they are the original detour in Hawaii. So Kyle and Auntie Terry are activists, and they work as advocates for demilitarization. And this led them to create the demilitarization tours, the detours, which expose the US military's social and environmental impacts in Hawaii, unsettle its claims to Hawaiian lands, and revitalize Hawaiian place names and stories, and lend support to Kanaka Maoli resistance and resurgence initiatives. So here's a map that they show on their detour, and all of the red are places that are currently occupied by the United States military. And what you see on the island of Oahu over here is that 25% of the land on this island is occupied by the United States military. And let me tell you, they don't clean up their messes. So these aren't sites that have land that is vibrant and alive and well, but often are sites of superfunds, such as in Pearl Harbor. But their tour begins at Iolani Palace and then travels to Camp Smith and Pearl Harbor War Memorial, ending in the Hana Kehau farm in Waiawa. At Iolani Palace, they examine the Hawaiian Kingdom, the economic and geopolitical and ideological factors driving the US-backed overthrow of the monarchy and the prolonged military occupation of Hawaii. The palace provides a setting for telling stories of continuous Hawaiian resistance and to annexation and the contemporary use of the palace as a gathering place and symbol of the Hawaiian independence movement. Let me go back and you can see that picture one more time. This is us on a tour of, on the detour with Uncle, with Kyle Kajihiro, who is right here. And this is the Iolani Palace. From there, we jump on a bus and we drive through Chinatown to Camp Smith, which is up on the hill. Kyle and Auntie Terry's detour moves to Camp Smith, the headquarters of the U.S. Pacific Command, where they discuss how Keavalua, o Pu'uloa, also known as Pearl Harbor, was crucial to U.S. imperial expansion across the Pacific. Standing at the head of the monstrous military octopus, they narrate the various manifestations of militarization and its impact in Hawaii and across the Pacific region. From Camp Smith, we travel down the hill to Pu'uloa, to Pearl Harbor. At the Pearl Harbor Memorial, they recall Hawaiian place names and stories and critically interrogate the discourse of innocence and security that legitimize and naturalize the U.S. presence in Hawaii, as well as across the Pacific and in Okinawa as well. And finally, at Kanakehau Farm, the tourist participants learn about an initiative to restore Hawaiian cultural knowledge and land use practices in the shadow of the ruined environment of Pearl Harbor. This Huaka'i narration concludes with thoughts about consequences of military policies that implicate Hawaii in America's wars against peoples in distant lands, and our responsibility to address both the impacts of militarization locally and abroad. The book ends with part 4, Hawaii Beyond the Big Eight, New Mappings. And we wanted to include this section to disrupt the notion that Hawaii is geographically bounded by the 8 main islands often featured in the guidebook. With this section, we wanted to stress that the boundaries of Hawaii stretch to all the places where Kanaka Oiwi visit, live, dwell, and die. In other words, while the islands are crucial to Hawaiian sovereignty and identity, they are a piko and umbilical cord that connects Kanaka Oiwi to their collective ancestral homes and not a measure of authenticity or a boundary. Hawaiians have always voyaged by choice beyond the shores of the islands. And as David Chang's essay in this collection notes, Kanaka Oiwi have a long tradition of voyaging and have themselves been part of explorations and migrations that have crisscrossed the Pacific and beyond. Challenging the notion that natives stay and tourists go, Chang's historical mapping of the routes that Hawaiians have long traveled is an important corrective to assumptions that Indigenous people are fixed both in place and in time. He asks, quote, as Indigenous people of one land who are living on the lands of other Indigenous people, what is the kuleana of Oiwi in diaspora? What are their obligations, born of their genealogy and of their connections to place? Paheala e ponoai, what is the right way to act in such circumstances? For Kanaka and diaspora, the question is a very real one, end quote. These questions are very real for the non-Kanaka visitors who come to Hawaii for vacation, as well as for those who migrate to our shores to live. What is your kuleana and how will you carry it? At the same time, though, Hawaiians have been forced to move because of political, economic, social conditions beyond their control, such as the prison industrial system that has systematically exported disproportionate numbers of Kanaka Oiwi to the arid lands of Turtle Island. In this new carceral mapping, the strain of a discriminatory legal system disperses the family and the community and strains the ties that bind us to our homelands. And that's a really important essay by Sunny Ganadin. The last section, though, is crucial. Hawaiians do not stop being Hawaiian when we leave Hawaii, and we carry our familial relationships and our ethical. We are still kama'aina even when we are not on the lands of our ancestors. So in traveling elsewhere, we are also bound by decolonial ethics to restore and support the ea of the lands and peoples wherever we may dwell. And I want to end up my presentation with this image. I like this image, and it's taken from Linda Ferruto's essay, We Never Voyage Alone. Linda is a teacher of ethnomathematics, is a settler and a teacher of ethnomathematics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, who is fortunate to take part in the educational worldwide voyage of the Hōkūlani. First built and launched in the 1970s, the Hōkūlani symbolizes the revival of Indigenous ocean exploration and navigation. More than that, however, its mission is also very much tied to the protection and proliferation of the values of the people of the Pacific. Narrating her particular legs of the journey, Ferruto discusses the kinds of knowledge exchanged with various global communities that she encountered during the voyages. A particular insight when returning to the United States sheds light on the protocols that need to reemerge for decolonization to be more than just a metaphor, to go beyond land acknowledgements towards the restoration of Indigenous diplomacy. This is a long quote, so bear with me. She writes, en route to Manhattan, the crew members requested permission from the First Nations to enter their lands in the Chesapeake Bay. As Hōkūlani approached from the distance, the original stewards gathered at the dock, waiting for her arrival. Chief Billy Tyack of the Piscataway Nation and Chairman Francis Bray of Piscataway Kainai tribe gave the signal that allowed the Pacific Voyaging Society crew members to join them ashore, and then extended an invitation to participate in a solemn ceremony. The Hawaii delegation entered with traditional genealogical chants, mele, and hula, acknowledging respect for our Native American hosts. Po Kalepa Babayan formally requested permission to enter the Piscataway land, and reflected on the mission of the Malama Honua worldwide voyage. To seal the ceremony, Chief Tyack resolutely expressed, got to take a deep breath for this next one. You are the second vessel to enter this area in 400 years, and you are the first to ask permission. It is our great hope that together we will be able to reverse some of the damage that was caused by the first vessel, end quote. In many ways, this exchange marks the kind of principles and protocols that Detours wants to establish with this guide to decolonialism in Hawaii: permission, reciprocity, and responsibility. These are portable values for wherever we travel and wherever we settle. A'ole I pau. What my presentation today offers are examples of how people variously positioned in relationship to Hawaii are working to restore ea. And I do not want you to leave with the idea that the work of decolonization is something that only happens over there in Hawaii. Rather, decolonization needs to happen everywhere. Everywhere we walk is Indigenous lands, and we need to honor that and be accountable to it. Decolonization is not achieved by checking boxes. Rather, decolonization and the restoration of ea are the practices that must be done day after day and generation after generation. Ole I pau, the work is not yet finished. When I consider the work we are doing in Detours focused on Hawaii, it should also be an invitation to consider the work that still needs to be done in the places where we all live, here in Utah, on the lands of the Eastern Shoshone people, for example. I hope this presentation inspires you to take up the call to decolonize your relationships to lands where you live, dwell, and work, and cultivate ea, or whatever the equivalent word is in the Indigenous vernacular of the places where you live. So mahalo and aloha ʻāina. That is my really long presentation that captures the themes of the book, gives you a sense of some of the chapters that are in there, and now we can open it up to a larger discussion and questions and answers. So I'm going to turn it over to Sandra to help moderate that. And
okay, thank you, Hōkūlani. That was an excellent presentation. I learned so much, and the postcard visual was really great. I really...
Sorry, okay, that was my child.
worries.
I have 3 children here with me, and yeah, they all stop for lunch at different times, and that was one. Sorry, I wasn't muted when I was telling my child, no, she needs to go do her thing. Sorry.
No problem. I was just saying that I really loved the postcard visual. It really created a different idea for me. I really liked that. Let's get into questions. So our first question is from David, and he says, "What are the advantages of the lack of tourism during the pandemic? How long will it last?"
So I'm not in Hawaii right now to talk, and so I can't speak directly to what the advantages are to not having tourists in Hawaii right now. From what I understand from my friends who still live in Hawaii, is that they're able to enjoy the beaches in a way that they haven't been able to because of, you know, the overcrowdedness that happens there. And, you know, so I think many of us here are tuning in from Utah. I'm just making that assumption. That's where I live. What we also know during the height of the pandemic, when we were under lockdown, is that our air quality improved, right? I think that we're seeing similar kinds of things happening in Hawaii, is that tourism brings about a lot of pollution. And so with the limiting of tourists coming to the islands, it also means that there's also less pollution. It does, however, produce an economic strain on the islands that are being felt and reverberating across all industries, right? I mean, this is the problem with economies or places that rely on 1 or 2 industries for its entire economy. If either of those shut down, then it creates a major economic crisis. And I think that they're experiencing that in Hawaii right now. So the 2 major industries are tourism and the US military. So that's what I would say. Yeah, so I know that there's an economic strain, but then there's also an opportunity for folks to re-engage with the land in a way that they haven't been able to because it's not necessarily been accessible to residents, to people who live there.
Great, thank you. Michael says, "Is there a movement to obtain nation status similar to Native Americans for sovereignty?"
Yeah, so, okay. Tracing the history of resistance to colonization and resistance to the resistance movement and the sovereignty movement in Hawaii is an entire course. And Professor Maile Arvin at the University of Utah in the Department of History teaches a course called, I think it's called History of Hawaii. And so if you want a really good in-depth understanding of all of this, I would take her class. Just, you know, saying. But yes, there have been movements there are multiple movements for part of the sovereignty movement. There is no one single sovereignty movement in Hawaii. I think what the person might be speaking to is processes for federal recognition of Native Hawaiians as Indigenous peoples to the United States. That process, there are many who support it and there are many against it. David Miley's essay that I mentioned in my presentation is an analysis of when the Department of Interior was in Hawaii to get during their public comments period to find out what people had to say about whether or not they wanted federal recognition to go through that whole process. And as Miley, as I said in my presentation and as is documented in Miley's article, most people oppose federal recognition. Rather, what people prefer is deoccupation, for the sovereignty of the Hawaiian kingdom to be restored. Folks who support deoccupation argue that the overthrow was illegal and everything that happened from that one moment of an illegal overthrow, everything forward is also illegitimate and illegal, meaning the annexation as well as statehood. And so they argue for the reinstatement of the Hawaiian kingdom's sovereignty and thus the deoccupation of Hawaii by the United States of America. So again, it's a very complex history and covers a lot of ground. That's just a little a little thumbnail sketch of what could be a much deeper, complex story.
That's great, thank you. Judy says, mahalo, that was very interesting. An anonymous person said, should the traditional monarchy of Hawaii be restored?
I don't know. I think that's part of the question, right? When we talk about the removal, the reinstatement of the sovereignty of the kingdom, we also need to be thinking about what then does that look like, right? And I think that that's a complex question that folks get to debate, and that we should debate and that we should discuss. But I'm not going to advocate one thing or another, because I think, again, we're talking about sovereignty. The people need to decide what that should look like and how that should go forward.
Great, thank you. Angela says, what are the Hawaiian views on the, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Papa Hana Umokuakea Marine National Monument and other protected designations by the U.S. federal government? Are they seen as protecting natural areas or excluding people from areas that they were once able to use more freely?
Well, I think the answer to that is a both and, right? It's both. It is provides some protections for these places, but it also creates some restrictions, right? And as we know that, so I teach a course right now called Gender and Nature, and we're looking at it through the lens of an Indigenous environmental justice framework. And we just recently talked about how Indigenous peoples and nations often, as a tactic for protecting their lands, turn to things like national monument status in order to do that work. And so it comes with certain benefits. For example, it protects the oceans. And in a time of climate change, when our oceans are are becoming more and more contaminated and more difficult for our marine life to survive, that's huge. We need that, right? But it also comes with some limitations. It means that, yeah, not everyone gets to do whatever they want there. It restricts some economic development that happens there. It doesn't necessarily allows Indigenous peoples full access to those places and to use those places in the way that their ancestors had used them, right? So it's a push-pull kind of situation. It's both beneficial and it's also a limitation. But when we think about, from an Indigenous perspective, if the strategy is to, let me back up. As an Indigenous person who understands the land and the oceans to be my ancestor, my kin, my family members, then I want to do whatever it takes to protect them, not just for me, but into the future. And we have to use different tactics to do that. And national monument status is an important tool for doing that. We know that to be true here in Utah. The Bears Ears Monument that President Obama set up just at the end of his term of office was super important to the 5 nations that are protecting it right now. And when that land was reduced by almost 85% and opening it up, that damages the land. That damages for all future generations, not just for the Indigenous peoples, but for everyone. And we need to have that foresight, that thinking into the future, and to be responsible to future generations in a way that we are not right now. So I would say that it's a both and situation, but there's a number of Native Hawaiians who are really actively involved in the monument and who do a lot of work there. And we have an essay in our book that of the Hōkūlani going up into the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and traveling up there, and what that feels like to be able to re-engage with the ancestors who are also part of our ʻāina, but also, again, not often remembered as being part of the ʻāina archipelago.
Great, thank you. Catherine says, Hoku, such profound issues. Can you discuss the decision process for ASA to be held in Honolulu? What decolonial procedures were put in place or not?
Yes, okay, so yes, so in, let's see, I'm going to say that back in 2012, when the American Studies Association was looking at sites for, future for sites to host the annual meeting of the association. They looked at Hawaii and they sent representatives to Hawaii to talk with, honestly, the tourism industry representatives. And I was invited to be at one of those meetings. And what immediately I saw was that I was going to do everything that I could in my power, my limited authority based on the spheres of influence that I have, to make sure that the vision for American studies, that the vision was not the tourist one. That people who came to Hawaii as part of the American Studies Association National Meeting came with a very clear framing that this is an indigenous place, that the history of Hawaii as part of the United States is a contested one, it is not settled, and that there would be opportunities for folks, for participants, for registered participants to actively engage in those legacies, in legacies of resistance and land-based actions that were taking place at that moment. And so we were really fortunate. Well, I'm a member of the council and part of the program committee, and we worked really closely with folks in Hawaii to infuse the program with examples of resistance and decolonization. We also, created tours. So as at the top of this presentation, I thank the Hawai'i Council for the Humanities, because they also provided funding that allowed us to offer tours that are in our book to American Studies participants. And so we had a tour out to a decolonial tour out to the, what do we call the plantation villages over on the west side. We did a detour of Waikiki with Auntie Terry. We did we did a detour of downtown where the economic district is, the finance district, and the palace is. And I think we even did a military detours, the demilitarization tour. So we were able to weave all of these values, all of these practices directly into the program in order to create a very different kind of experience for folks to participate. It also provided us an opportunity. Okay, the book was not quite out yet when ASA, it hit the warehouse 2 weeks before we all were going to be in Hawaii. And so books were shipped from the warehouse directly to Honolulu for this conference. And so folks weren't able to read the book before they arrived, but they were able to purchase it while they were there and read it in order to shape what I hope they did was read it and shape then their experience while they were in Hawaii. And that's really what the book is intended to do, is to help us think about and to reorient ourselves to this amazing place. I want to make a pitch though. Okay, so I think the book, King's English, has ordered the book. I'm not sure if it's right now available at the King's English because of shipping and things, but you can purchase the book at the King's English. Then you can also go on to Duke University Press and purchase the book. And right now, Duke University Press has a 50% off. They're doing their 50% off sale. And so you could also buy it there if you want to take a look at it. So that's what we did at American Studies Association meeting in order to, really be clear and intentional about how we were going to frame it, and then what we were going to do with the program in order to actualize those values.
Great, thank you. And I know the King's English, even if there is a wait, it's not very long. We ordered a book and it came in 2 weeks, I think, after. So not too bad.
And please support our local bookstores. They need our help. So there's a sale over there, but go to the King's English.
Okay, so Thomas says, sorry, don't know if my question got in. How does Ea respond to the Kanaka and Kama'aina whose livelihood has been lost because of because they've become dependent on tourism?
In times of crisis, it really opens up new opportunities and new ways to engage. And what I know is happening in Hawaii, again, through my friends who live there and who are also struggling financially and economically with the shutdown of the tourism industry, is that folks are turning to their communities, and we're really strengthening community responsibilities to each other and community ties. There's some really important work happening on that level. Also, for the past 20 years, a lot of communities have been working to restore Indigenous food systems at lots of different scales. And those projects are underway, and they feed people. They produce food that can feed people. So we're also, while, for the past 20, 15 years, at small scales, communities have been working to establish alternative Indigenous economies and development projects, and et cetera. But what it means, though, is that right now, when the major economic engine has fallen apart, there are alternatives. And the alternatives are at a scale that can help the people around them, right? And I think that's super important thing to think about, is the scale at which we can make transformative change. And at the level of neighborhoods, at the level of, in Hawaii, we think about it in the context of ahupua'a, or in moku, so watersheds, districts, or even at the level of ili, of small parcels, or a collection of smaller parcels where we can restore, like the Keawa Nui fish pond, restore a traditional Hawaiian aquacultural system, right? And then you pair that with the lo'i taro system, the wetland taro system, and we have both starch and protein, right? So and these projects have been ongoing for a while. And so they do open up opportunities for folks to, rather turning to the global food system, but turning inwards to our Indigenous food systems and the work that's being done locally in smaller scales to address these issues. Because people have been saying for a long time, what are we going to do if the ships stop coming? 85% of the food that's imported, that people eat in Hawaii, comes from ships. What happens if those stop coming, right? How are we going to feed ourselves? And there wasn't a good answer to that question. So folks have taken that seriously and done a lot of work to address that, again, at the local level, and really local level.
Very interesting.
And there are hardships, no doubt about it. Don't want to under stress that, how this is a difficult economic time for everyone. But we also have to look to alternative economies and Indigenous economies to make it through. And I think that's going to make us stronger in the end.
Thank you. Julie says, I've recently studied the history of navigation by stars and sea in conjunction with Hōkūlani. Thank you for this wonderful Detours book to help me understand a place I have visited many times and want to now ask permission. So,
right, this question of asking permission seems super odd, right, for a tourist context, and yet it's one that, when we just think about manners and going to someone's house to visit, that knocking on the door and then waiting for the people who live there to open it, that's what we're talking about, right? Like, how might our experiences of a place be different if we knocked first before entering, if we waited for an invitation, right? Mm-hmm. So those, yes. And our contributors were we spent hours talking about that during our writing workshops in the developmental phase of this book, about this question of permission.
Thank you. Margie says, from what I understand from a friend who lives in Honolulu, there are many citations and tickets being issued such that people, natives and tourists, are not able to be outside and enjoy oceans and other beauty in Hawaii. Is this specifically directed to make up for a lack of tourism, thus diminishing lifestyle for the native locals? If so, how sad for the Indigenous people?
So I've asked friends about what that is like. And again, we are in a global pandemic. And so all of us, we all have to modify our behaviors and what we do in order to keep each other safe. This is a public health concern, right? And what we also know is that this disease has a higher impact on marginalized communities, right? Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, be it here in Utah or in Hawaii, are going to be hit the hardest. The Filipino community in Hawaii is getting hit really hard by this pandemic, right? And so restrictions are necessary and needed. And yeah, folks are pretty bummed about it, but they also appreciate when they are able to go to the beach, they also appreciate being able to enjoy the beach without having to, I'm going to say this word, compete with tourists. I've been to the beach before where like tourists yelled at us because we were taking up too much space because they wanted all of their towels strung out on the beach and they wanted all their own space. And yeah, it was a fight. That it didn't come to a fight. But having to interact with tourists who think that they have a right to all places in Hawaii, irregardless of where it is, it's a lot. It's frustrating.
Definitely. Joyce says, how would Hawaii's military and tourism-based economy change if Hawaii became a sovereign nation?
It's a good question. It's a good question. It's one that folks keep asking, right? So again, this is where it's also way too complex of an answer for this kind of format. And again, recognizing there are many different independence groups that advocate for different kinds of models and structures. So one model has as its vision would be that the U.S. that we would negotiate a relationship, that the government, the reinstated Hawaiian Kingdom government, would negotiate a relationship with the United States to probably maintain the military. However, there are other independence advocates who would argue for the removal of the US military from Hawaii. So again, that's a very complex question that has an even more complex set of answers that really require us to go back and look at that history of overthrow and the political the politics of that historical moment, including the legal aspects of it, in order to understand why different groups are advocating for different kinds of relationships with the United States, including the United States military. One thing to keep in mind is that wherever the United States military is in the Pacific, be it Guahan, be it, in Okinawa, comes environmental degradation and social problems. So having, when we talk about security in the United States, right, we have to remain safe and our military keeps us safe. But the military also comes with some serious problems, and many Pacific Island nations are advocating for demilitarizing their places because of the damage that it brings and the history of damage that it has brought to the islands and continues to bring. So it's a very fraught relationship.
Yeah, very difficult. Someone says, what is the Polynesian population living in the Hawaii Islands? Not sure.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, and I haven't checked my census data lately. My understanding is that in Hawaii, the Native Hawaiian population is just under 20%. But I don't know what the larger Pacific Islander population is in Hawaii. And then that, again, would be a major aggregation of a very complex groups of people.
Margie says, mahalo for your thoughtful answer. And then Joyce says, how about tourism? I think she was talking about your response to the military occupation.
Oh, yes. Okay. So the piece about tourism is that there, again, just as I was talking about for the past 20 years, folks have been working to create more food security in Hawaii at the local level. I think folks are also thinking really critically and creatively about how to engage tourism in a much more ethical way. So what is not so ethical one way to visit Hawaii that isn't as ethical is to like rely on Airbnbs. Airbnbs in Hawaii Hawaii has such a major problem with housing, especially affordable housing, that Airbnbs make it difficult for folks who live there to find housing. And when they do, it's really, really expensive. And so again, when we're thinking about decolonizing tourism, we need to be thinking about lodging. We need to be thinking about where people go, how many people should visit, what their impacts are in terms of both the food that needs to be imported to feed all of them, as well as the sewer. How much can our sewer system and our waste disposal system manage all of the waste that is produced by tourists? When we think about tourism in Hawaii, it's a 9-to-1 ratio. 9 million people visit Hawaii every year, and there's only about 1 million people living on the entire ʻāina, right? So when we're thinking about the impact of tourism, we've got to rethink it in radical ways, right? From the food people eat to waste disposal, because that 9-to-1 ratio is huge and has a major impact. We also know that with climate change and the sea level rise, that much of Waikiki is going to be underwater in the next 50 years. So what does that, I mean, again, the infrastructure of tourism needs to be rethought, as well as all aspects of it. And people are doing that work on the ground. They're doing really important work. And even Native Hawaiian land-based organizations, such as the one I used to work with, are thinking about, like, how do we, engage outsiders, visitors in a way that's about sustaining us all, as opposed to extracting resources from this land for the desires, of foreigners. So I think there's lots of ways to do that, and folks are doing it in really creative, innovative ways.
Yeah. Okay, so Marshall says, what about the trust that owes a lot of Hawaii, maybe owns?
So I think what he might, and what that person might be speaking to is the Kamehameha Bishop Estate, which is a private land trust set up by Princess Pauahi Bishop at the time that was set up, that she put in her will, that she was set up after she passed away. And she became the holder of all of these lands as one of the last surviving ancestors of Kamehameha the Great, the first. And so as other ali'i passed away, they willed their lands to her, and then they were consolidated into this trust. The mission of the trust is that the revenues from those lands would support the Kamehameha schools. And so that's the Bishop Estates. And yes, they're a major landholder in Hawaii, and they're a major player in terms of the economic and political structure of Hawaii. And beyond that, I'm not sure what the person wants to hear. I mean, I think that, again, when we're talking about land tenure in Hawaii and the way that private property operates, it's a very complex landscape. And you should come take some classes at the University of Utah in Pacific Island Studies and learn all about these kinds of things, because we talk about them. Because again, when we're talking about colonialism, be it here on the continent of the United States, on Turtle Island, or in the islands in Oceania, these are all very complex histories that you have to understand in order to make sense of what's happening now and the land tenure and the land issues that are happening currently. So those things are always working together. How about one more question, and then we can.
Okay, I think we're actually done. I think there was just, I think you kind of answered this one already, but is there a movement within the government to promote these concepts?
I would say not perhaps at the state level. We have a couple of, so Sonny Ganadin is running for elected office on Oahu in Kalihi, and he's going to be someone who will be advocating for these kinds of issues if he's elected. So if you're in Hawaii and you are part of that district, vote for Sonny. but really, this is a grassroots movement. This has been a grassroots movement from the beginning, even with the overthrow of the Queen and the Ku'e petitions, the petitions to reinstate the Queen and to sanction the U.S. military for their role in the overthrow of the Queen. That was boots on the ground, people organizing, going door to door to sign a petition that says, no, that was not okay. We do not consent to the United States coming in and taking over our country. And that again, like I talked about, a'ole, people have been saying, a'ole, no, we do not consent from the very beginning. And they continue to say, a'ole, we do not consent. We do not consent to a 30-meter telescope on our sacred mountains. We do not consent to windmills right by schools. We do not consent to pesticides being tested on fields right next to schools. We do not consent to any of that. And I think that's and that's at the grassroots level, at the level of the maka'ainana, of the people of the land, saying, a'ole, we want it a different way, and we're going to make sure that happens. So that's how I would think about it.
Great, thank you. I think a lot of your presentation gives us so much to think about and kind of sit with in an uncomfortable way, because we're so used to Hawaii being all about paradise, and there's a lot to it, a lot more to it than that. And I really appreciate everything you've done to help open our eyes to that. And I'm excited to read your book. I've read one of the chapters and I'm excited to keep going. I've learned so much from you, and I think everyone here has as well. So thank you so much, Hōkūlani, for joining us. And this presentation will be posted to our website and our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to revisit it, you can. Thank you, Hōkūlani.
Mahalo and aloha ʻāina.